All right, we're back again. And I'm not sure where my marker is. Disappeared. That's no good. It's gone. Oh well, I can find it. I know where we were. I stopped at a really, really good spot, right? Oh yeah. He whispered something into Marcellus's ear. No, Justice, declared Marcellus gruffly. I'm not a fool. I don't believe that, and neither do you. But I saw him, persisted Justice, unruffled. Marcellus swallowed convulsively and shook his head. Why do you want to say a thing like that to me? He demanded testily. I happen to know it isn't true. You might make some people believe it, but not me. I hadn't intended to tell you this painful thing, Justice, but I saw him die. I saw a lance thrust deep into his heart. I saw them take his limp body down, dead as ever a dead man was. Everybody knows that, Justice said calmly. He was put to death and laid away in a tomb, and on the morning of the third day, he came alive and was seen walking about in a garden. You're mad, Justice! Such things don't happen. Careful, warned Justice. We mustn't be overheard. Pushing his plate away, Marcellus folded his arms on the table. His hands were trembling. If you think Jesus is alive, he muttered, where is he? Justice shook his head, made a hopeless little gesture with both hands, and drew a long sigh. I don't know, he said dreamily, but I do know he is alive. After a quiet moment, Justice brightened a little. I'm always looking for him, he went on. Every time a door opens, at every turn of the road, at every street corner, at every hill crest. Marcellus's eyes had widened, and he nodded understandingly. I knew you were always expecting to meet someone, he said. If you persist in that habit, you'll lose your mind. Neither man spoke for some moments. Marcellus looked toward the door. Do you mean to say, he asked cautiously, that you wouldn't be surprised if Jesus came in here now and asked Shalom to serve him his supper? Justice repressed a smile at the sight of Marcellus's almost boyish expression of complete bafflement. No, he replied confidently. I shouldn't be surprised at all. I confess I was badly shaken the first time I saw him. As you say, such things don't happen. They're quite impossible. Had I been alone, I should have doubted my senses, and my sanity too. Where was this? Demanded Marcellus, as seriously as if he expected to believe the story. At Ben Joseph's house. Quite a little company of us. 10 days after Jesus had been put to death, we had a simple little supper together. The sun had set, but the lamps had not yet been lighted. There had been much talk about Jesus' reappearance. Several of the disciples claimed to have seen him. I, for one, didn't believe it, although I kept still. There had been a lot of confusing reports. On the morning of the third day, some women had gone to the sepulchre and found it empty. One of them said she had seen Jesus walking in the garden and that he had spoken to her. Hysterical, I'd say, put in Marcellus. That's what I made of it, admitted Justice. And then there was a story that 2 men had seen him on the highway and asked him to have supper with them at an inn. Reliable people? I didn't know them. One was a man named Cleopas, a cousin of Alphaeus. I never heard the other man's name. Sounds like poor testimony. It occurred that way to me, said Justice. Some of the disciples declared he had come into the room where they were sitting that same night, but they were terribly wrought up, and I thought they might have imagined seeing him, what with so many strange reports flying about. Naturally, agreed Marcellus. Once the story started, the hallucinations multiplied. Well, go on. You were at Ben Joseph's house. John had been telling how he looked and what he said. That's that dreamy young fellow, eh? Yes, that's the one, Justice went on, undisturbed by the implications of Marcellus's query. And when John had finished his story, Thomas stood up and spoke his mind, and my mind too. I don't believe a word of it, he shouted, and I don't intend to believe it until I have seen him with my own eyes and touched his wounds with my hands. He was a bold fellow, remarked Marcellus. Was John offended? I don't know, said Justice absently. He didn't have much time to be offended. Jesus was standing there, at Thomas's elbow. "No, Justice." Yes, with the same compassionate smile we all knew so well. A spectre? Not at all. He was a little thinner. You could see the effects of the bad treatment he had suffered. There were long scratches on his forehead. He held out his hands to Thomas. "Did you all gather about him?" asked Marcellus with a dry throat. "No, I think we were stunned. I'm sure I was. I couldn't have moved if I had tried. There was complete silence. Jesus stood there, holding out his hands and smiling into Thomas's eyes. You could see the deep wounds in his palms. "Touch them," he said gently. This was too much for Thomas. He covered his face with his hands and cried like a child. The dining room had cleared. Twilight was settling. Shalom came over to inquire if there was anything else he could do for them. Marcellus glanced up bewilderedly at this summons back to reality. "I've been telling my friend some things about Jesus," said Justice. Yes, nodded Shalom. "Once, when he honored my poor house, he was seated there, sir, where you are sitting." "Did he rise and speak at the dinner?" asked Marcellus. "He did not rise to speak," remembered Justice. "He told a story," said Shalom. "It seemed someone had asked him to explain what was meant by 'my neighbor,' as it is written in our law, and Jesus told a fable about a man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, a dangerous road, and beset by Bedouins had stripped, robbed, and wounded him, leaving him half dead. A priest came along and saw him, but passed on. A Levite, too, paused, but went his way. Then a Samaritan came. We don't care much for the Samaritans up here, sir. And tied up the man's wounds and took him to an inn. Which of these men, he asked, was a neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" "Well, that was easily answered, I think," observed Marcellus. "Had I been here, I should have asked another question. I am told that Jesus did not believe in fighting, regardless of the circumstances. Now, if the brave Samaritan had arrived while the Bedouins were beating the life out of this unfortunate fellow, what was he supposed to do? Join in the defense, or wait until the robbers had completed their work and fled?" Shalom and Justice exchanged looks of inquiry, each inviting the other to reply. "Jesus was interested in binding up wounds," said Justice solemnly, "not in inflicting them." "Does that answer your question, sir?" inquired Shalom. "No," said Marcellus. "Perhaps we should go, Justice. It is growing dark." They rose. "The fish was good, Shalom. Let us have another for breakfast." Taking up the little lantern that Shalom had provided, Justice led the way across the well-kept grounds to the tent where he lighted their larger one and hung it on the center pole. Marcellus unlaced his sandal thongs, took off his belt, and lounged on his cot, eyes following Justice as he made his bed. "And then what happened?" asked Marcellus, after Thomas looked at the wounds. "Ben Yosef filled a dinner plate and offered it to Jesus," said Justice, sitting down on the edge of his cot. "There was a piece of broiled fish, a small loaf, and some honey in the comb, and Jesus took it and ate." "Not just a spirit, then," commented Marcellus. "I don't know," mumbled Justice uncertainly. "He ate it, or some of it." The day was fading fast. Philip suggested that the lamps be lit. Andrew, who was near the door to an adjoining room, went out and returned with a taper. Old Ben Yosef held up a lamp, and Andrew lighted it. And Jesus wasn't there. "Vanished?" Marcellus sat up. "I don't know. It was getting dark in there. He might have gone out through the door, but nobody heard it open or close." "Had he come in through the door?" "I don't know. I didn't hear it. The first I knew, he was standing there beside Thomas. And then when the lamp was lighted, he wasn't there." "What do you suppose became of him?" "I don't know." Justice shook his head. There was a long silence. "Ever see him again?" asked Marcellus. Justice nodded. "Once more," he said, "about a month afterward. But in the meantime, he was up here in Galilee." A very unfortunate thing happened on the night Jesus was tried. When they had him before old Annas, Simon was waiting in the courtyard where the legionaries had built a fire. A servant girl had said to Simon, "You're a friend of this Galilean." And Simon said, "No, I don't know him." "But I thought Simon was a leader among the disciples," remarked Marcellus. "That's what made it so bad," sighed Justice. "Ordinarily, Simon is a bold fellow with plenty of courage, but he certainly did himself no credit that night. He followed along at a distance when they took Jesus to the insula and waited across the street while the trial was held. I don't know where he went after the procession started out toward the place of execution, or where he spent the night and the next day. I heard him confess it all. He was sick with remorse and hurried back home. So Simon wasn't present on that first occasion when the disciples thought they saw Jesus? No, but Jesus told them to be sure and tell Simon. Did Jesus know that Simon had denied his friendship? Oh yes, he knew. You see, that's why he was so anxious to have Simon know that everything was all right again. Well, the next morning, the Zebedee brothers and Thomas decided to take old Bartholomew home. He had been sick, so they put him on a donkey and set out for Galilee, where they found Peter, restless and heartsore, and told him what had happened. He was for rushing back to Jerusalem, but they counseled him to wait, for the news of Jesus' return was being noised about, and the priests were asking questions, and Ben Yosef's shop was being watched. So that night they all went fishing. In the early morning, at sunrise, they left off and sailed toward the east shore. Bartholomew said that when they were within about 200 cubits of the beach, chilled and drowsy from their long night on the water, they were suddenly roused by a loud shout and a splash. Simon had jumped overboard and was swimming. They all leaped up to see what had come over Simon, and then they saw Jesus standing at the water's edge waiting. It was a very tender meeting, he said, for Simon had been quite heartbroken. And then Marcellus's voice was impatient. Did he vanish as before? Not at once. They broiled fish for breakfast on the beach. He sat and talked with them for above an hour, showing special attention to Simon. What did he talk about? Their future duties, replied Justus, to remember and tell the things he had taught. He would come back, he said, though he could not tell them the day or the hour. They were to be on the alert for his coming. After they had eaten, someone suggested that they return to Capernaum. They had beached the boat, and all hands, except Jesus, fell to work pushing off into the water. Bartholomew was up in the bow rigging a sail. The others scrambled over the side and shipped the oars. And when they looked about for Jesus, he was nowhere to be seen. But he appeared again, another time. The last time he was seen, said Justus, I was present. It was on a hilltop in Judea, a few miles north of Jerusalem. Perhaps I should tell you that the disciples and other friends of Jesus were closely watched through those days. Such meetings as we had were late in the night and held in obscure places. In Jerusalem, the temple people had the legionaries of the insula patrolling the streets in search of us. Up here in Galilee, Herod Antipas and Julian the legate had threatened death to anyone who so much as spoke Jesus' name. They too believed that Jesus had returned to life? Inquired Marcellus. Perhaps not, I don't know, but they knew that they had failed to dispose of him. They thought the people would soon forget and settle down to their old ways, but it soon appeared that Jesus had set some forces in motion. I don't understand, broke in Marcellus. What forces? Well, for one thing, the temple revenues were falling off. Hundreds of people, accustomed to paying tithes, stayed away from the synagogues whose priests had persecuted Jesus. There was no violence, but in the marketplaces throughout all Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, merchants who had thought to win favor with the authorities by denouncing Jesus found that their businesses were failing. The Christians were patronizing one another. It was apparent that they were in collusion and had a secret understanding. An edict was published prohibiting any assembly of Jesus' adherents. We agreed among ourselves to hold no more meetings until such times as it might be more prudent. About how many Christians were there in Jerusalem at that time? Asked Marcellus. A score, perhaps? A score is 20. About 500 had declared themselves. One afternoon, about 5 weeks after the crucifixion, Alphaeus came to my house saying that Simon had called a meeting. A week hence we were to assemble shortly after sunrise on a hill quite off the highway, where we had often spent a day of rest when Jesus was with us. Knowing it was dangerous to be seen on the roads in company of others of our belief, we journeyed singly. It was a beautiful morning. As I came to the well-remembered footpath that led across the fields toward the hills, I saw, in the early morning light, several men preceding me, although I could identify none but Simon, who is a tall man. As the grade grew steeper, I overtook old Bartholomew leaning on his staff, already tired and laboring for breath. Had he walked all the way from Capernaum? Asked Marcellus. And had spent the whole week at it, said Justus, but it seemed that the hill would be too much for him. I counseled him not to try, that his heart might fail him, but he wouldn't listen. So I gave him an arm, and we trudged along slowly up the winding path that became more difficult with every turn. Occasionally we had glimpses of the others, widely separated, as they climbed the rugged grade. We were about halfway up when Bartholomew stopped, pointed with his staff, and hoarsely shouted, "Look you! On the rock!" I looked up, and there he was. He was wearing a white robe. The sunshine made it appear dazzling. He was standing on the big white rock at the summit, waiting. Were you amazed? No, not amazed, but eager to press on. Bartholomew urged me to leave him. He would make it alone, he said, but the good old man was half dead with weariness, so I supported him the rest of the way. When we came out at length on the little plateau in a shady grove, we saw him. Jesus was standing with both arms outstretched in a gesture of blessing. The disciples were kneeling about his feet. Oh, excuse me, hiccup. Simon, with his great hands covering his face, had bowed over until his head nearly touched the ground. Poor old Bartholomew, much moved and thoroughly spent, couldn't take another step. He fell to his knees. So did I, though we are at least 100 cubits from the others. We bowed our heads just as his voice broke. For a moment he was overcome with emotion. Marcellus waited silently for him to regain his self-control. After a while, continued Justus thickly, we heard the murmuring of voices. We raised our eyes, and he was gone. Where, Justus? Where do you think he went? Asked Marcellus huskily. I don't know, my friend. I only know that he is alive, and I am always expecting to see him. Sometimes I feel aware of him, as if he were close by. Justus smiled faintly, his eyes wet with tears. It keeps you honest. He went on, you have no temptation to cheat anyone, or lie to anyone, or hurt anyone, when, for all you know, Jesus is standing beside you. I'm afraid I should feel very uncomfortable, remarked Marcellus, being perpetually watched by some invisible presence. Not if that presence helped you defend yourself against yourself, Marcellus. It is a great satisfaction to have someone standing by, to keep you at your best. Justus suddenly came to his feet and went to the door of the tent. A lantern was bobbing through the trees. Someone coming? Inquired Marcellus, sitting up. A legionary, muttered Justus. News of Demetrius, perhaps. Marcellus joined Justus at the tent door. A tall legionary stood before them. I bear a message, he announced, from Legate Paulus to Tribune Marcellus Lucan Gallio. Tribune, murmured Justus in an agitated voice. The legate presents his compliments, continued the legionary in formal tones, and desires his excellent friend Tribune Marcellus to be his guest tonight at the fort. If it is your wish, you may accompany me, sir, and I shall light your way. Very good, said Marcellus. I shall be ready in a moment. Tarry for me at the gate. The legionary brought up his spear in a salute and marched away. Apparently Demetrius is safe, exclaimed Marcellus brightly. And I have betrayed my people, moaned Justus, sinking down on his cot. I have delivered my friends into the hands of their enemies. No, Justus, no. Marcellus laid a hand on his shoulder. All this may seem disquieting to you, but I assure you I am not a spy. It is possible I may befriend you and your people. Wait for me here. I shall return by midday tomorrow. Justus made no response, sat dejectedly with his face in his hands until Marcellus's footsteps faded away. It was a long night of agony and remorse. When the first pale blue light appeared, the heavy-hearted Galilean gathered up his few belongings, made his way to the silent street, and trudged along, past the old fort, to the plaza. For a long time he sat on the marble steps of the synagogue, and when the sun had risen, he proceeded to the little house where he had left Jonathan. Thomas's mother was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "You are early," she said. "I was not expecting you so soon. I hope all is well with you," she added, searching his troubled face. "I wish to be on the road as soon as I may be," he replied. "But where is your young Roman and your little pack train?" "They are remaining here," said Justice. "Jonathan and I are going home." Chapter 18. Paulus had been in command of the fort at Capernaum only a week, but he already knew he wasn't going to like it here. For a dozen years he had been hoping to get out of Manoah. It was a disgrace to be stationed here, and the empire meant you to realize that an appointment to this fort was a degradation. The buildings were ugly and shabby, the equipment bad, the climate abominable. No provision had ever been made for an adequate water supply. On the sun-blistered grounds there wasn't a tree, a flower, or a blade of grass, not even a weed. The air was always foul with yellow, abrasive dust. You couldn't keep clean if you wanted to, and after a few months at Manoah, you didn't care. The garrison was lazy, surly, dirty, and tough. With little to do except occasional brief and savage raids on the Bedouins, discipline was loose and erratic. There were no decent diversions, no entertainment. When you couldn't bear the boredom and discomfort another minute, you went down to Gaza and got drunk, and were lucky if you didn't get into a bloody brawl. As for that vicious old city, was not Gaza known throughout the world for the squalor of its stinking kennels where the elderly riff-raff of a half-dozen quarrelsome races screamed imprecations, and the younger scum swapped unpleasant maladies, and the hapless stranger was stripped and robbed in broad daylight? Gaza had her little imperfections, there was no doubt about that. But she had docks and wharves and a spacious harbor, little coastal ships tied up to her piers. Bigger ships lay at anchor in her bay. You strolled down to watch them come and go, and you felt you were still in contact with the outside world. Sometimes ship's officers would come out of the fort for a roistering evening. Sometimes military men you had known in Rome would visit you while their vessel took on cargo. Paulus's unexpected appointment to Capernaum had been received with hilarious joy. He had never been there, but he had heard something about its quiet charm. Old Julian had been envied his I don't know what that means. Old Julian had been envied his post. For one thing, the fort was within a half-hour's ride of Tiberias, that ostentatious seat of the enormously wealthy sycophant, Herod Antipas. Paulus had no notion he was going to like this toad. He had nothing but contempt for these provincial lick-spittles who would sell their own sisters for a smile from some influential Roman. But Herod frequently entertained interesting guests who, though they might despise him, must make a show of honoring his position as Tetrarch of Galilee. Perea. Some unusual names here. And Capernaum, everyone said, was beautiful, ringed by green hills with snow-capped mountains in the distance. There was a lovely inland sea. The people were docile. They were reputed to be melancholy over the execution of their Jesus, but they were not violently resentful. Doubtless that problem would solve itself if you gave it time. Old Julian's tactics, listening at the keyholes of cottages for revolutionary talk, the posting of harsh edicts, floggings and imprisonment, what did they accomplish but to band these simple, harmless people together for mutual sympathy? Of course, if the foolhardy fishermen persisted in making a nuisance of their cult, you would have to punish them, or get yourself in trouble with Herod. That's what you were there for, to keep the peace. Now that you were here, you had much more peace than you'd bargained for. Had the gods ever ordained such quiet nights? Paulus had not fully appreciated this oppressive silence for the first day or two. There was the novelty of settling into his immeasurably better quarters. He proudly inspected the trim pleasure craft that Herod had placed at the disposal of the legate. He luxuriated in the well-equipped baths, thinking kindly of old Julian, whom he never had any use for. The fort buzzed with activity. A fairly large contingent from Manoah had accompanied Paulus. There had been the usual festivities at the insula in Jerusalem during Passover week, though Paulus had been moody and taciturn. anxious to have it over with and move on. Is that word taciturn or taciturn? I forget. His retinue had come along to Capernaum for defense on the journey as well as to dignify his inauguration. A generous dinner had been served after the ceremonies to which Herod, represented by a deputy, had contributed lavish supplies of potent wine. It was a noisy night. Heads had been cracked, noses flattened, more urgent arguments had been settled with knives. Paulus had filled the courtroom with battered celebrants, had crowded the guardhouse, had stormed and shouted oaths new to the local legionaries, and well pleased with his first day's duties, had gone to bed tight as a drum. Next day, the Manoa contingent had left for home, all but Sextus. At the last minute, Paulus, with a premonition of loneliness, had told Sextus to remain, at least for a time, and when the last of them had disappeared, a strange quietness settled over the fort. That night, after Sextus had ambled off early to bed, Paulus sat by his window and watched the moonlight on the lake. Except for Sextus's snoring, the silence was profound. Perhaps it had been a mistake to retain Sextus. He wasn't very good company after all. What did one do for diversion in Capernaum? The little town was sound asleep. The Herod family was away. Tiberius was dead as a doornail. If this was a sample of life at Capernaum, he had been better off at Manoa. The days trudged along, scraping their sandal heels, sitting down now and then for a couple of hours, while time remained standing. Isn't that a good use of personification? Days trudging along, scraping their sandal heels, and time remained standing. Paulus, strolling in the courtyard, paused before the sundial, read its laconic warning, Tempus fugit, and sourly remarked to Sextus, It's apparent that old Virgil never visited Capernaum. After a week, Paulus was so restless that he even thought of contriving some errand to Jerusalem, though his recent visit there had been lacking in interest. Perhaps that was because the insufferable young Quintus, who had been sent by the crown to reshuffle the Palestinian commands, was too much in evidence. Paulus, who was a good hater, had never despised anybody so quickly, so earnestly. Quintus was a vain, overbearing, patronizing, strutting peacock. He was an insolent, ill-mannered puppy. He was a pompous ass. In short, Paulus didn't like him at all. But Quintus would have sailed for home by now. Maybe Quintus was what had ailed Jerusalem this time. Let's see if there's a good place to stop. A little bit. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting. Paulus and Sextus had been apathetically shaking the old leather dice cup on the long table in the courtroom. Sextus yawned cavernously and wiped his eyes. If it's bedtime, drawled Paulus, perhaps we'd better light the lamps. He clapped his hands. A guard scurried up. Paulus pointed to the lamps. The guard saluted and made haste to obey. 9, mumbled the legate, handing the dice cup to his drowsy friend. At this juncture, old Namius had come in with 3 disheveled... disheveled? How do you say that word, too? This book makes me aware of my lack of vocabulary. Oh. Somewhere, Paulus felt, he had seen that tall Greek. Sextus jogged his memory. Demetrius. He had always liked Demetrius, in spite of his cool superiority. Demetrius was a haughty fellow, but you had to have respect for him. Paulus suddenly recalled having seen an announcement posted at the insula in Jerusalem, offering a reward for the capture of a Greek slave belonging to Tribune Marcellus Gallio. The bulletin said that the Greek had assaulted a Roman citizen in Athens and was thought to be hiding in Jerusalem. So, here he was. Somebody had gathered him in. But no, a brief examination revealed that Demetrius had been arrested on suspicion. He had been loitering, he was shabby, he had money. In prison he had fought the rascally Syrians who denied him water. So much for that. Then Paulus had wanted to know about Marcellus, who had been reported crazy, or next thing to it, and was delighted to learn that his friend was in the neighborhood. But before he could release Demetrius, he must learn something about this charge against him. If it were true that he had struck a Roman and run away, you couldn't dismiss him so easily. Paulus put them all out, including Sextus, who didn't like it. Demetrius, Paulus frowned judiciously, what have you to say about this report that you are a fugitive, that you struck a Roman citizen in Athens? That is very serious, you know. It is true, sir, replied Demetrius without hesitation. I found it necessary to punish Tribune Quintus quite severely. Quintus! Shouted the legate. You mean to say you struck Quintus? He leaned forward over the desk, eyes beaming. Tell me about it. Well, sir, the tribune came to the inn of Eupolis with a message for my master. While waiting for the reply, he made himself grossly inoffensive to the daughter of the innkeeper. They are a highly respected family, sir, and the young woman was not accustomed to being treated like a common trollop. Her father was present, but feared to intervene lest they all be thrown into prison. So, you came to the damsel's rescue, eh? Yes, sir. Don't you know that you could be put to death for so much as touching a Roman tribune? Demanded Paulus sternly, and when Demetrius had slowly and remorsefully nodded his head, the legate's frown relaxed, and he asked in a confidential tone, What did you do to him? I struck him in the face with my fist, sir, confessed Demetrius, and once I had struck him, I knew that I had committed a crime punishable by death, and couldn't make my position any worse, so you hit him again, I think, surmised Paulus with mounting interest. Did he fight back? No, sir. The tribune was not expecting the first blow and was unprepared for the next one. In the face? Paulus's eyes were wide and bright. Many times, sir, admitted Demetrius. Knock him down? Oh, yes, sir, and held him up by his helmet strap and beat his eyes shut. I was very angry, sir. Yes, I can see that you were. Paulus put both hands over his suddenly puffed cheeks and stifled something like a hiccup. And then you ran off? Without a moment's delay, sir. There was a ship sailing. The captain befriended me. Tribune Quintus was on board and would have had me apprehended, but the captain let me escape in the small boat at Gaza. From there I walked to Jerusalem. Didn't the captain know he could be punished for that? Growled Paulus. What was his name? I can't remember that, sir, regretted Demetrius after some hesitation. That is undoubtedly a lie, said Paulus, but you are to be commended for your loyalty. So then you went to Jerusalem. Why? My master expected me to come shortly. What did you do there? Demetrius told him of the weaver's shop. Paulus grew interested again. I understand there's a weaver's shop where the leaders of Jesus' people meet. What was the name of your weaver? Ben Yosef, sir. That was the name. And how did you happen to be in that company, Demetrius? Are you perhaps one of these, what do they call them, Christians? Yes, sir, confessed Demetrius tardily. Not a very good one, but I believe as they do. You can't, shouted Paulus. You have a good mind. You don't mean to tell me that you believe all this nonsense about Jesus returning to life and being seen on various occasions? Yes, sir, said Demetrius. I am sure that it is true. But see here, Paulus stood up. You were out there that day and saw him die. Yes, sir, I am sure he died, and I am sure he is alive. Have you seen him? Paulus's voice was unsteady. Demetrius shook his head and the legate grinned. I hadn't thought, he said dryly, that you could be taken in by such a story. Men who die do not return. Only fools think so. Paulus sat down again, relaxing in his chair. But you are not a fool. What makes you believe that? I heard the story from a man who did see him, a man of sound mind, a man who does not lie. Demetrius broke off, though it was evident he would have said more. Very well, go on, commanded the legate. It did not surprise me very much, continued Demetrius. There never was a person like that before. Surely you, sir, must have noticed that. He had something nobody else ever had. I don't believe he was an ordinary man, sir. How do you mean not ordinary? Are you trying to say that you think he was something else than a man? You don't think he was a god? Yes, sir, said Demetrius firmly. I think he was, and is, a god. Nonsense! Don't you know we're locking up people for saying things like that about this dead Galilean? Paulus rose impetuously and paced back and forth behind the long table. I mean to let you go, for your master's sake. But, he stopped suddenly and shook a warning finger, you are to clear out of Galilee. And there's to be no more talk about this Jesus. And if you ever tell anyone that you told me about your assault on Quintus, and I learn of it, I'll have you flogged. Do you understand? I'll have you stripped and lashed with a bullwhip. Thank you, sir, said Demetrius gratefully. I am very sorry that I struck him. Then you don't deserve your freedom, growled Paulus. That's why I'm turning you loose. Now you're sorry for what you did? And you believe that dead men come to life? You're crazy. He clapped his hands and a guard stalked in. Make this Greek comfortable, he barked. Have the physician attend to his cuts. Give him a good supper and a bed. He's to be released from prison. Demetrius wincingly brought his arm up in a salute and turned to follow. One more thing, rasped Paulus to the guard. When you have finished with the Greek, return here. I want you to carry a message to Shalom's inn. Make haste. All right, stop there for today.